From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. In a historic, landmark ruling, the Supreme Court has defined what it means, in law, to be a woman.
The Supreme Court has ruled unanimously the word woman in law refers to biological sex. That rules against an interpretation by the Scottish Government that transgender people with a gender recognition certificate are entitled to sex-based protections.
For those campaigning for women's rights, it was a momentous victory.
We thought we were going to see rights for women rolled back, and today the judges have said what we always believed to be the case, that women are protected by their biological sex, that sex is real, and that women can now feel safe that services and spaces designated for women are for women.
For trans women, it was a setback.
I find it very difficult to enjoy existence in this society because I'm always battling with what will someone else think of me and where I'm going and who I am.
What exactly does the Supreme Court's decision mean? What will change? And how did the courts come to be debating what it means to be a woman? The Story today. Legally a woman.
I'm Helen Joyce. I work at a human rights charity called Sex Matters. We campaign for clarity on sex in law and everyday life. And I'm also an author and journalist. And in 2021, a book I wrote called Trans When Ideology Meets Reality came out.
Back in 2017, you started looking into this. It's come to a head with this big Supreme Court decision today.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
How did that feel?
Actually more emotional than I thought it would be. The judges accepted and said in such clear, down-to-earth, reality-based language that our main anti-discrimination law and our protections against sex discrimination cannot operate unless you understand the sexes to be the biological categories and not paperwork from the government. And this is what the women who took the case for Women Scotland, it's a grassroots group, but also women all around the UK who've been fighting for years about this. This is what we've said. We've said these are real categories. This is not paperwork. Women aren't discriminated against on the basis that somebody assigned them a female at birth and gave them that piece of paper. We're discriminated against because we're female, and that's real. So it was emotional. It was emotional to hear it and to realise that now all the people who have equivocated about women's rights, all the people who said, 0.1% of women have a penis and all this sort of nonsense, that's all been thrown out. The Supreme Court has spoken. In the Equality Act, male people are men, female people are women. There are two sexes, and the protections are on the basis of sex.
Well, we'll come back to that in a moment and the implications of this judgment. Before we do, a lot of this, I suppose, comes down to two pieces of legislation and the clash, the tensions between them. So just talk us through the two bits of legislation.
So the older one of them is the Gender Recognition Act, which passed in 2004. And that is a law that allows somebody who has got a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, it allows them to apply for a thing called a gender recognition certificate. And they can use that to get a reissued birth certificate with their sex and the birth certificate changed. And when that law was passed, they put in a whole load of sort of exceptions. They said this doesn't count for parenthood. So a woman who has a baby who gets a piece of paper saying she's a man remains the child's mother. Mm. It doesn't hold for sex crimes because in this country only men can rape because it's about the penis. So what if the person with the penis has a piece of paper saying is a woman? It would be for the first time, does that mean it's not rape? So they put in all these sort of caveats saying they still understood that there is a biological reality out there. But the fact is, it said that the base case is this thing changes your sex for the purposes of laws, except the ones we said. And then in 2010, the Labour government had, on its way out, had created this very overarching law called the Equality Act that brought together lots of different strands of previous laws like sex discrimination, race discrimination, disability protections, belief discrimination, into one big omnibus act. And it ported over the things that were in the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975. But the Gender Recognition Act had been in between. So now the words man and woman, male and female had been destabilised. And I don't think people thought through what the implications were. Like, obviously, we meant man and woman really in 1975. But in 2010, did we mean that the Gender Recognition Act had moved the people who have these gender recognition certificates between the two categories? Between 2010 and 2017, various feminist lawyers in different places started to notice that if you wanted to take a case about sex discrimination, which is all about comparators, like you're a woman who's being treated in a certain way, would a man have been treated in that way?
Equal pay, for example.
Yes. Or, detriments of various sorts.
Yeah.
That something had gone wrong because now if the Equality Act takes into account the Gender Recognition Act, then the two sexes are mixed sex categories. Yes, you've moved some men into the woman bucket and you've moved some women into the man bucket. And now none of your arguments are straightforward. And the same for sexual orientation. If a man gets a piece of paper, a heterosexual man gets a piece of paper saying he's a woman, now he's a lesbian. Any lesbian-only group of more than 25 people would by law have had to admit a heterosexual man who had a piece of paper saying he was a woman. So lesbians' freedom of association was destroyed. And then the other one is this thing called the public sector equality duty, which is a duty on all public organisations, so, local authorities, government departments, regulators and so on, that whenever they write a policy, they have to think through the various protected characteristics. That's the way the Equality Act works. There's 9 of them: sex, race, age, etc. And they have to think, like, how does this policy affect people under these headings? Are we being unfair to Muslim people here? Are we being unfair to disabled people here? That sort of thing. So for the public sector equality duty, the two sexes have become mixed sex categories. So when you are writing a policy, so for example, a council that's saying we're going to revamp the changing rooms in all our gyms and swimming pools, at no point would they think to themselves, how does this affect women? These sound like sort of esoteric legal arguments, but the thing is these policies are being written all the time, and lobby groups like Stonewall were telling everybody that self-ID was the law of the land. And with remarkable speed, all the things that were women only suddenly became open to any man who said he was a woman. And if you complained about this or said anything about this, not only would you be called a bigot, but honestly, you risked your job.
And there have been some very high-profile cases around this. I mean, tell us, for example, of some of the experience in prisons.
So the prison service decided that it would allow men who identified as women to apply for transfer to women's prison. And they did this, and they moved, in Scotland especially, they moved some really very violent men who had tortured and murdered, men who had raped multiple women. These men said they were women and got transferred to the women's estate. And this was all happening behind closed doors. And again, this went beyond the law. These weren't people who had these gender recognition certificates. They were just men who said that they were women. Everyone could have said no to them, but they didn't.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because what did the law actually require for somebody to say they were a woman?
Well,
for these gender recognition certificates?
Really not, I have to say, not very much. Like, you just had to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which honestly there are doctors who'll do that for you online very cheaply and easily. You had to say that you had, quote, lived as a woman for 2 years. But honestly, what's living as a woman? Like, I don't know if I live as a woman, whatever that means. Like, I just am a woman.
There's no test
for
this.
No, seriously, there's no quality control on living as a woman. We just go around the place, being ourselves. I mean, I'm not womaning.
But you never had to prove that you were about to undergo an operation?
No, absolutely not. So that was one of the things about the 2004 Act. It was the first national law anywhere in the world that didn't require what is called sex reassignment surgery. There's no condition whatsoever to take hormones, to get surgery, and lots of people don't, because these surgeries are quite brutal and barbaric, frankly. So you now have people who have a birth certificate saying that they were female, and they just are male. They look male. They sound male. I'm not saying that I care whether a man has a beard or not, but I'm just trying to paint a picture for your listeners. You could be talking about somebody who's 6'6", deep baritone voice, beard. I don't think that women have to dress a certain way either, but, they're just ordinary men. Yeah. And that person is now legally female.
And you've talked about the prisons case. There were others that really hit the headlines. For example, rape centres. Tell us a bit about that.
So women's centres come under a lot of pressure because they're always on short-term funding. They get their money from all sorts of different places, like from the probation service, from the local council, from the NHS and so on. And over the past decade, funders, often thinking that they're doing the right thing, told all these women's centres and rape crisis centres and so on that they had to admit trans women, that they had to be, inverted commas, inclusive. And then some rape crisis centres, I'm sorry to say, went all in on this on ideological grounds. And an example is the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, which not only decided that it was trans inclusive, but actually appointed a man who identifies as a woman as its CEO. And then when one of its counsellors said that women who come to the Rape Crisis Centre need to know the sex of their counsellor, well, she was forced out. She then had to take an employment tribunal. She won in the employment tribunal on belief discrimination. And all she was saying was a woman who has been raped really does need to know that she can get support from another woman.
Yeah. It is a very vivid example of places where same-sex safe spaces are needed. I suppose trans women would say, where do they go if they get raped?
I mean, people always say that, and you'd think that rape crisis centres had been saying, oh, sod off, we don't care about you. They never did that. They will either offer you separate counselling, they will get you to come in on a different day, they will refer you. They never, ever told these people to just, sod off. But they just don't belong in a women-only space. And today I'm saying what the Supreme Court said, which is, it's because they're men. It's not because they're less deserving or bad people or because they deserved whatever happened to them. It's nothing like that. It's just that they're men. If you set up as a women-only space, you have one job, and that is to be a women-only space. And the Equality Act has always said that there are times that the only way to be fair to everybody, and in particular to women, is to separate men and women. People didn't intend it to be broken by the Gender Recognition Act. It's sort of like two laws. It's as if they were two sorts of gears that got their gears enmeshed, and now what the Supreme Court has done today is it's managed to unmesh them, and now they can both turn and operate properly.
It's a great description. And just in terms of the tensions that were propping up between those two separate laws, were there implications for things like sport?
Yes, the way that equality law works, if you just step right back, is it says don't discriminate because that's a bad thing to do for equality, except sometimes you have to discriminate for equality. A disabled parking badge. I can't get a disabled parking badge because I'm not disabled. So actually, there's discrimination in favour of disabled people there, but it's in the service of greater equality.
Yeah.
Women cannot have fair sports unless you have separate sports for men and women. So those are called the single-sex exceptions, and what they mean is don't discriminate except when you should. So you can offer mammograms only to women. You can have sport that's only for women. You can have changing rooms that are separate by men and women. All these everyday and specialist things, it's fine to offer them by men and women. But they didn't notice that they had turned the two sexes into sort of mixed sex categories because of the Gender Recognition Act, and that's what's got fixed today.
And just give us an overview of some of the other places where this became a real tension. For example, in the workplace.
Absolutely. So in the workplace, there's regulations that date from 1992 that say that your employer has to provide you with single-sex changing and toileting facilities, unless you're not in a place where you need to do either of those things. But if you were to say that in workplaces between, I would say, roughly 2013 and maybe 2022, you would be told that trans women were women, that a man who said he was a woman had to be allowed into the women's toilets and changing rooms. But now suppose you want to just talk about it. You want to go to HR and say this isn't okay. My male colleague who now identifies as Josephine, that's fine. I've no problem with Josephine. Josephine's a lovely person, but Josephine doesn't belong in the women's toilets. Women have lost their jobs for doing that. Women have lost their jobs even for not talking about a specific person, but just talking about the policy. So Sex Matters was founded by a group of lawyers, but also Maya Forstater, who was working in a think tank when in 2018, Theresa May's government said that it was going to change the law to make it easier to get gender recognition certificates. You'd just get them by saying you wanted one. And Maya said that was a bad idea, that it would be bad for women's rights. Colleagues in the Washington office complained. They investigated her for transphobia, and then they ended her job. So she went to court And she had to fight through 4 legal hearings to get final victory on this.
Wow.
And she used another of the protected characteristics in the Equality Act, which is called religion or belief. So she had to argue that recognising that there are 2 sexes and that the 2 sexes matter and can't be changed, she had to argue that that was a philosophical belief. And in the Employment Tribunal, in her first hearing, which I think was 2019, she was ruled against. And the judge said that to believe that there are 2 sexes and that the sexes matter for women's rights was a belief that was unworthy of respect in a democratic society. And that puts it along with Nazism, reintroducing slavery, tormenting gay people. That was a really dark time. So then she went to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and actually it turned out it was really good that she lost in the lower court, because that doesn't set a precedent. But when you appeal, which she did, and she won on every respect, that did set a precedent. So now those beliefs, which are for shorthand, they're called gender critical beliefs. It just means, I prefer to say sex realist. There really are 2 sexes and it's not about identities. Those beliefs are now protected in the workplace, and that means that you can talk about it. But women are still being fired all over the country. Women are being fired for this. They're being disciplined. Anti-free speech policies in universities say that women who say, I stand with Maya, that gets people disciplined. The gender recognition certificate changes your sex for the purposes of some laws, definitely. Doesn't change your sex for the purposes of other laws, also definitely. And what today has done is it's put the Equality Act in the bucket of doesn't change your sex for this law. But the judges, oh my goodness, the judgment was so beautiful. It was so clear. They set out their reasoning and it was so reality-based and so touching all the main points, like 10 out of 10, honestly. And then the other thing is, it's the sort of thing they have to say that, this wasn't a triumph. What it was a triumph for Women Scotland, who are the grassroots group who brought this case. And it was a defeat for the Scottish government and for everybody who has misrepresented the law over the last 15 years. So that's not a triumph for women over trans people. That's completely the wrong way to look at it. This was not a competition between women and trans people. It was a competition between people who wanted the law to be clear, workable, and to protect everybody's rights, and people who wanted pieces of paper to be able to override reality. And reality won.
I mean, there will be people who were very depressed by this judgment. Victoria MacLeod, a retired judge who changed her sex more than 20 years ago, said she was barred from giving testimony, and that there is a sense that perhaps their voice wasn't heard, and this will erode some of their rights. They will now have to use male toilets, for example.
Well, Victoria MacLeod should never have gone into the women's toilets. I understand that somebody who was told 20 years ago that it was okay to use women's spaces would now be upset. But what are we to do? Women need single-sex spaces. What the law does is it says to service providers that they can offer separate male and female toilets and that they can write clear rules.
Helen, take us back to how this case got to the Supreme Court. Take us back to Scotland. Why has that been the setting for so much of this debate?
Well, for reasons that are absolutely not clear to me, Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party decided that it was the hill they wished to die on, that anybody who wanted could identify as either sex. And so some years ago, they promised that they would bring forward a bill that changed the regime in the Gender Recognition Act so that there wasn't any requirement for a medical diagnosis, there wasn't any 2-year waiting period or anything like that. It would just be that you'd fill in a form online and you would get a new birth cert that said the opposite sex. And they called it the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. It pushed the bill through in quite unpleasant scenes in Holyrood around Christmas 2022. And at the same time, it was pushing through the most obscure bill you could imagine, a bill about representation of women on public boards. And it first said that they would have quotas for self-identified women. So this grassroots group called For Women Scotland went to court and won. And they managed to get that bill knocked on the head because it was not compatible with the Equality Act. The Scottish government came back again and it brought back a version of the bill with women as in certificated women. So women who have a birth cert, an original birth cert that says they're women, or men who have a Gender Recognition Act saying they're female. They were going to make quotas for these people. So For Women Scotland went back to court, and this time they lost. So they brought their appeal to the Supreme Court, and that was heard last November.
And the Scottish debate sort of ended up breeding its own version of a culture war, really. I mean, just tell us about some of the characters involved. For example, what began as a hashtag and very quickly became a book and a bit of a movement, Women Won't Weesht. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, I forgot to tell the rest of that story. So that got pushed through in Holyrood. Under the devolution settlement, Scotland has jurisdiction over its own affairs, but it can't interfere in affairs that go right across the UK. And the Westminster government said that this Gender Recognition Reform Act did do that it screwed up the Equality Act. But it really, trying to force through this unpopular bill, facing down the Westminster government, some really unpleasant things that were said about women campaigners by politicians who really should know better, some very ignorant takes on the law. All of these things resulted in the Scottish media, Scottish women, Scottish politicians, just being so much better informed on all of this complex subject than many other places. And it ended up being, ground zero for this fight. And the phrase women won't weesht means women won't shut up. And it became the rallying cry for the pushback against gender self-ID, against the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and against the Scottish Government's position in the case that we've just heard. They've written a book with that title. J.K. Rowling backed it. It's absolutely fascinating. But of course, women all over the UK are on their side.
And you mentioned J.K. Rowling. It also became a huge battle of wills, really, between two very big women in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon and J.K. Rowling. Just remind us a bit about how that played out.
I would love to know why Nicola Sturgeon decided that this was a fight worth taking. I mean, she describes herself as feminist to her fingertips. But really, to say what's good for women, you have to say who women are. You have to know. And I mean, she's just been obdurate in refusing to accept that if the sexes become mixed sex categories, then feminism really becomes pointless or obsolete or meaningless. So she went down one route, and J.K. Rowling decided that this was too harmful for women, and she started to use her rather large public platform on X. And it was such a shot in the arm. Oh, my goodness. The first time that she came out on all of this was, I mentioned my boss, Maya Forstatter. When Maya lost that case, I remember hearing about it. I was walking to a party in Westminster. It was just before Christmas, and it was raining very heavily. And Maya says that she can't really remember the next 72 hours because she just froze. And then the next day, somebody sent her a screen capture of J.K. Rowling tweeting, "I stand by Maya." And she thought they'd mocked it up to try to cheer her up. She didn't think it was real. And then it started coming in on every WhatsApp channel she had, and in by text, and in by email. Everybody was saying, "Have you seen?" So she went on Twitter and she saw that J.K. Rowling had said, dress how you like, wear what you like, sleep with whoever you'll have you. I will fight for your rights, but say that sex isn't real. And that's a problem. I'm not getting the words quite right here, by the way, but anyway, it's ended with #I stand with Maya. That turned it all around for all of us. There are so many people who are rich, who've made enough money that they could take a risk. And they say things like, "You're right, of course, but, I don't want to pick a fight with that lot." Or, "You're right, and I'd love to write about it, but my partner works in publishing and I don't dare." She dared. I'm actually emotional thinking about it now. I haven't cried yet today, so maybe I'll cry now.
That was Helen Joyce, writer and director of advocacy at Sex Matters. We'll put a link to her book in the description of this episode. For more coverage of the Supreme Court's decision, you can find all the latest at thetimes.com with a subscription and on Times Radio. The producers today were Shabnam Grewal and Rosie Stopher. The executive producer was Molly Guinness. Sound design was by David Crackles and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.